1 in 2 chance. So it doesn't matter if you flip it 400 times, you still have 50-50 chance. So when they say like the probability, for example, is like, 1 in 10 trillion. It doesn't matter how many times you happen, that 10 trillion, attempt at it doesn't make it 100% chance now. You still have that same probability. And that's why it is so hard to fathom why people don't look out at night and look in the stars and just imagine how we are the only ones right now that are able to observe it and be in awe and wonder of it. Just last year we had like the solar eclipse when it was like 1:30 in the afternoon and the sun was covered, and you start hearing all the animal life at night, come out and start making noises. Like, how does that stuff just happen? Like, how can they predict when the solar and lunar eclipses are going to happen? Why can we look to calendars to figure out how the full moons are going to happen? How can we figure out, when the solar eclipse will happen, every so often? When we think about the equinoxes, the solstice, and all those marvel things that occur within our lifetime. But then for the next portion they go into is morality. What determines morality? Like, how does morality exist? How can one group of people just say what's right and what's wrong? How can one culture apply their morality to another culture? So the conscience is that quality of the mind that either accuses or excuses human conduct. The conscience does not determine what is moral or immoral. Acts 23:1. It does recognize the existence of morality. So whence the origin of morality? If one does not acknowledge an eternal mind with intrinsic goodness in coexistence, how is morality to be explained? It is feasible that somehow, raw inorganic matter was able, by means of an extended process, to concoct, promote, and maintain morality. So when we think about the animal kingdom, do they govern murder? Do they govern, stealing? Do they govern, incest or rape or anything like that? Or do they, as animals, just live and they do what they need to do to continue to survive? They don't hold tribunals. They don't hold, court to process an act of violence from one species to another. They're living. They're going off of their instincts. They're going off of just how they are. One example I was told about, years ago was like when we think about World War II, and we think about the German aggression against Poland and France. Once a nation conquers another one, are they held liable to that conquered nation's, laws and rules? So like say when Germany conquered, Poland and took over Poland, or when they, started to take over France, could France prosecute them for violating their laws? Or is it that France became subject to German law? So you can't use those arguments to say, well, you did wrong because we say you did wrong. Well, it's like, well, I'm in charge now, so I don't care what you said. That's why during the trials of Nuremberg, they were prosecuted by a higher law, a universal law, a godly law, a godly, mindset, because just because you are in charge, just because, the iron rule of mind makes right, it doesn't mean that you can do whatever you feel like doing. There are some higher principles that you have to follow still. That's why they started to come up with the Geneva Conventions. So that way you know what rules to follow and what rules not to. That there's some type of basis of how you should conduct yourself during war. You can't just do whatever you feel like doing. And that's why when they introduced nuclear arms into conflict, it became such a point of just mixed feelings, because when you think about Hiroshima and Nagasaki, you're wiping out not just combatants but non-combatants. So you start to have to worry about the overall arching sense of morality. Is this right or is this wrong? Can we do whatever we want to? And again, people are the ones that can do that. When you have, lions attacking zebras, it's not like they're worried about how many zebras they take out, because all they're trying to do is just feed themselves. but people are the only ones that are able to do that. So even unbelievers admit that morality exists only in conjunction with personal minds. So what is the motivation for morality? The theist attempts to live the moral life because he is convinced that a moral God exists, who has obligated humanity to morality for the good of the species. And then we can ask questions like, has morality evolved? Or do we still kind of follow the, for the most part, like the Ten Commandments? You don't kill just to kill. You don't steal. You don't commit adultery. You try to, stay true to your partner. You try to do what's right for your family. You try to make sure that you're living in a moral sense. Because if there was no God, what would be the point? Like if God didn't exist, why would we be worried about morality? Why would people not just fall into a hedonistic, pattern of life of just doing whatever they feel like to make themselves happy? When you're able to do whatever you want to do, why not do it? So why does society not just cave itself and do what they want to do?
Some would argue that they are doing that now.
It's starting to become that way, it seems, for sure. But they're still not going out there and just murdering people because it makes them happy. Now they are leaning towards like euthanasia and abortion and things like that. But if you have a conflict with someone else, you don't just go out there and kind of just beat them down and shoot them, kill them, kind of thing. Mm-hmm. But you could argue there are some societies that do that will treat certain classes of people with no respect or dignity, for sure. But then we can go to this next point, like the motivation for morality. So animals have survived, but they have no moral code. So what is wrong with putting one's ambitions above everyone else's? So like, you kind of see that on the road a lot of times as you're driving. Someone has a place to be and is more urgent than what you're doing. So therefore they'll just drive 95, 100 miles an hour, on 475 because they got to get to that next exit before you do. Because they got somewhere to be and it's more important than what you're doing. If there is no morality, then why shouldn't we place, their personal desires before society's? Atheist Bertrand Russell wrote, "We feel that the man who brings widespread happiness at the expense of misery to himself is better than the man who brings unhappiness to others and happiness to himself. I do not know of any rational ground for this view." So like, for example, if you're married, why do you always put your spouse's needs before your own? Like, why do you always strive to put your kids' needs before your own? Because it's the right thing to do. But if there were no God, why? Again, like if God did not exist, if we were just simple beings on this plane with no understanding or no hope for a heavenly kingdom, why does any of it matter, and why do people continue to do it?
Why do what?
Then how is morality to be defined? What are the criteria by which the good is to be distinguished from the bad? Gaylor Simpson contends that there are no universal, eternal, or absolute ethical criteria of right and wrong. Every man becomes his own law, actually then his own God. So if one suggests that ethics is situational, he is implying that he could do wrong in certain situations. If ethics is autonomous, hence man is his own law, how could he ever be in a situation in which his conduct could be wrong? So if there is no God, then there is no such thing as evil. So again, if God did not exist, every action you did is just a personal belief of what of what you want to be right and wrong. That there is no higher standard. That we're trying to follow the rules of the land, but that's the only governance we have. So then the question is, does immorality have an ultimate consequence? Again, if there is a God,
Yes.
there has to be a consequence. for our actions. There has to be a reason why we're doing what we're doing. If there is no God, there is no consequence. So it doesn't matter. Because when Paul said, I believe in 1 Corinthians, though, if there is no Jesus, then we have no hope. All of this is in vain. But we know that there is a God. We know that Jesus did come to earth. So therefore, there is an ultimate consequence. So attempting to press the point that whenever one admits that man possesses moral responsibility, he must likewise concede that there is an ultimate moral accountability, and that demands a God. Suppose one steals $10,000 from a multi-millionaire, or like Trump, and the wealthy person is not hurt, either physically or economically. He never misses the money, and the thief is never apprehended. Is that wrong? And that's what's been going around, for a while now. Like, if no one really gets hurt, is it wrong? Like, if you commit an offense where no one gets hurt, is there anything wrong with doing it?
You're hurting yourself
You are hurting yourself, and how?
because of what you've done. It's gonna have consequences either in your mind or, it will somehow affect somebody around you.
It will. I mean, and the thing is, like, even if it doesn't hurt you at that moment, what happens is eventually your heart's gonna get hardened to where it becomes easier and easier and easier. And the crimes will get worse and worse and worse. Like, if you just start off at in your home, right? You take $10 from your mom or from your dad, and then you leave and you take $100 from your boss or from your store, and you just continually gradually increase those acts of crime. Eventually your heart's gonna get hardened to where you just don't care what you're doing. It's kind of like when you think about drugs. You might start off with just like taking some type of drug that you're not prescribed to, and you get kind of addicted to it, and therefore you want to keep continuing that pattern. And you keep on increasing what you're doing, because what happens is you start off and you have that feeling that you want, but then it takes more and more to get back to that feeling, to where you keep on going high, but then your low gets even lower. So now you're trying to get back to middle. So you just gradually increase what you're doing just to have that sense of euphoria. You want to have that sense of just peace and calmness, and you want to be happy, and you don't care what it takes. So like if you're drinking alcohol and it takes, you're trying to get drunk, and as a kid, you see like 1 or 2 beers maybe. But by the time you become an adult and you're trying to get back to that sense of just not feeling anything, and it takes you, 24, 36 beers, whatever it is, it just shows you how much it affects your body and your mind. To where in order just to be happy now, you no longer care about anything else other than your own happiness. And that's where the morality comes in. Is it right or is it wrong? At the end of the day, you're still hurting yourself no matter what it is. And that callus that you're creating on your mind, on your body, is going to affect other people. So has a wrong been committed? Back to that question. Will there be ever any consequence for the deed? In final analysis, will it produce any effect that is different, let us say, than if a man had fed or starved a child? Paul, the Apostle of Christ, and Adolf Hitler are 2 well-known historical characters. Both are now dead. So far as they have now concerned, does it really matter, or does it make any difference how they live their lives in such a different way? When we think about Adolf Hitler, he did some atrocious acts. And then you think about yourself, you might think to yourself, are there any people named Adolf around the world? Or has that name kind of been cut off from history, from anyone ever to be named after them? Whereas with Paul, how many people have been named Paul? There's, first names, last names, middle names, where people find it a privilege to have the name Paul. And you can find examples throughout your life of just people that you want to honor, or people that have made such an impact in your life that maybe you named a child after them. Whereas with those people like, Jezebel, you don't see any Jezebels now. You don't see any Adolfs now. You don't see some of those people throughout history that have committed those atrocious acts. You don't hear those names because of what it brings to mind. And that's how an impact, morality has on us. Just because a person doesn't believe in God doesn't mean that there's no right and wrong, that there's no universal standard. So, to get to some questions, some class discussions, like cite some examples of design in God's creation. Like, is there anything that you see in your life that just blatantly says that God exists?
Robert. I think springtime is a really good way, and there's so many ways, but
Yeah.
springtime to me is always a time for discussion because you cannot explain it. You cannot explain why a month ago everything was gray and brown and pretty much dead, and then this rejuvenation. How does this plant come out of a bulb year after year after year like that? Like, that's just not some coincidence. Or the leaves on the trees that just come out every single year. And you can go farther and talk about the Earth's axis and how the sun shines at different degrees, and therefore, it heats up the ground, and just all of that is a discussion for, like my son is maybe more of a agnostic, he's more of an atheist, and I feel like the conversation with him is science. It has to be science, because it has to be something that he can relate to as an intellectual, and not feel like you're just checking your brain at the door and blindly walking into this. Like, if you look, and scripture tells us, anyone who looks will find. The Lord will see the Lord. And so I think those are good ways to have conversations with people.
I mean, when you think about how fast it's moving on its axis, how fast it's circling the sun, how long the moon has been around the earth, and what the impact of the moon has on the earth. Like, how can that just be a coincidence? How can that just be a random accident that happened within the universe to where life is now able to be sustained on one planet out of 9 within our own solar system?
You can use their laws of thermodynamics to prove that things just don't randomly happen. Like, a tornado doesn't go through a forest and leave a subdivision. Like, things just don't randomly come together beautifully. And by having those discussions, it at least might get them thinking.
Yeah.
I always think of what was the human body and how everything works just right to keep you alive. But also like gravity and like float like in like water and being able to float on water, like ships or boats. Like everything has to weigh out just right in order for that to happen. Or like gravity within out in space. Like, how are we not colliding with other planets? Like, everything has to be the right weight, the right everything in order to avoid that.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to imagine that the fact that the Earth is rotating, which creates, centrifugal force, which pulls everything down to the Earth, maintaining, the law of gravity, not allowing things to escape. The other day, like, my wife and I were having a discussion with our kids about Joshua and how the sun stood still while they were fighting. Like, what would happen if that happened today? Like how would we explain the sun not moving? So that way Joshua could defeat the Canaanites while he was conquering the land of Canaan. Like, what implications is that? Because when I'm trying to think about that, it's like the sun's not moving, the earth's not moving almost. So why are people not falling off? But there are so many miracles within the Bible that if you think about the practicality of it and how it was possible for the Red Sea to part or for the Jordan River to stop, flowing, like, there are laws in nature that have always been in place as long as the earth has been created, but God's able to suspend them. if those laws were ever to stop, if we just stopped spinning on this earth, what would happen? You know, for the seasons, like, how is it that every year we're able to predict when we're going to experience the spring equinox? How are we going to predict the fall equinox? How is the universe so precise that we can make calculations again for the solar eclipses for the next 300 years? How can we do that? I mean, like, because I know we had a solar eclipse back in 2017, and they predicted another one in 2024, and they happened, just like they predicted it was going to happen. And again, that's because of how precise the universe is. It runs by laws. It runs by like mathematics. You're able to predict stuff because there is a design behind it. It didn't just randomly occur and things just pop out of nowhere and now we have life. I mean, when we're thinking about evolution, like, there has to be a first. When you have people, there has to be a first. So we know Adam and Eve, but if we didn't believe in Adam and Eve, what was the first thing that could have created a offspring that would have resembled a human? And then how could you reproduce with that? Like, how can you answer these questions if you don't believe in God, if you don't believe in creation, if you don't believe in the design?
I can't help but think that, God talks about allowing people to be deceived.
Mm-hmm.
And I've always really pushed this, I think, like with scientist types that are coming up with all this stuff. God's showing their foolishness. They come up with all these ideas that are just foolishness to God. And yet he'll allow them to move forward with that. I also, like the world has always kind of believed in God, even though they might believe in multiple gods.
Yeah.
Throughout history, they've always knew something was causing something. And they kind of I don't know how long ago atheism started. It's probably been around for a long time. I don't know. Never studied it, but I just can't help but think God is allowing these people's minds to be twisted to the fact that, and he's actually hiding the truth from them at some point. He says he'll hide the truth from them, allow them to be deceived. As far as the morality thing, I've never really thought about that as far as proving that God exists, but he tells us where that comes about. It was in the Garden of Eden when they took of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It doesn't talk about the animals taking that. The men specifically ate of that, and that's when they got that knowledge and in essence became moral creatures. They knew good and bad, evil. They knew there was a difference. Animals, as far as we know, it's never told that they ever partook of that tree.
Yeah.
And so that kind of goes back to where I think in my mind, that's where it started.
I mean, because like when you go back to that account, you can read that Eve knew that it was wrong. Like she was told that we couldn't do it. But then what happens after they eat is like they start to determine their own morality. They start to determine their own like rules and laws. Where, well, I know God said this, but now I don't believe it. I don't agree with him. And that's why God had to kick them out, because if they would have ate of the tree of life, then that would have continued for all eternity. And in that sense, so they already knew like kind of what was right and wrong because they knew God said not to do it. But now we as people, we can see throughout society, people are trying to make their own justifications of what's right and wrong.
Exactly, and I think that it's not that they don't believe in right or wrong, they're just moving the needle.
Mhm.
Because if you talk to them long enough, you'll find where their needle is. Like start talking about crimes against children. There's a right and wrong right there, and they know it. It's just that the needle's getting moved.
Yeah. I mean, because when you have abortion debates, and you're trying to determine when is it acceptable in human standards to allow abortion to occur. And there are people who are saying up until birth.
Right.
And it's like, so what separates a preborn child that is at the point of delivery from a post-birth child?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's the exact same child, just 30 seconds apart.
I don't mean to keep talking,
It's okay.
but a couple years ago, someone, it might have been Terry, had a devotional, I don't know, maybe it was Brian, I don't know, about an eagle, and that it's against the law to rob an eagle's nest of an eagle egg. because the law recognizes that an eagle's egg is an eagle. But yet, we can't quite come to that same determination for a human. Even though the general public can understand an eagle's egg is an eagle.
Well, I mean, like,
Except in cases, if a pregnant woman is murdered, it's a double homicide.
yeah,
Our law recognizes that.
I mean,
So, I
yeah.
mean, there's no double standard there, right?
I mean, cause like, when you think about PETA, and you think about what they've done, you know, for the animal kingdom, like, you can't go hunt whales, and you can't go hunt, you know, pregnant whales, and you can't go kill, you know, pregnant, you know, animals because they want the population to occur. So why is it so wrong for that to happen, but when it comes to, you know, humankind, they have no problem with it? And a lot of times, it goes back to morality because it's the woman's decision now. Like, even though that child within the womb is independent, it's only necessary in the sense that it requires the mother for the nutrients because it's still connected, it's still growing, it's still developing. But it's still independent where it has its own heartbeat, it has its own brain, it has its own, you know,
Blood type.
DNA, blood type. Like, how can a child's blood type be different than the mother's if they're not independent? So there are, you know, reasons why we can argue from a Christian perspective of design, because there's so many examples in this world where you can see that there is a person behind it. I remember having a discussion like 20 years ago with someone who I thought at that time was agnostic. I think he's more of a theist now, but it was about a computer. Like, what was the background of how a computer was designed and created? It was based off of a neurologist who was studying the human mind and was able to translate that into a computer. They were able to create and simulate a hard drive that acted like a human mind. Everything we have in this life is based off of something that someone's already had. Like, there is no original thought in the sense that without our five senses, we haven't created anything that we haven't observed or learned. We haven't just created something out of nowhere. When we try to think of like an alien, and we try to like, everything of science fiction, every time there is a creature in sci-fi, it has something that we observe with on this planet. It could have had a humanoid appearance, it could have had an insectoid appearance, or it could have had an animal, but somehow, some way, it's related to within our five senses of what we're able to observe. We can't create anything that we don't even know about, because we don't know what we don't know. So, and it goes back to God. It's like, how can we create a God unless we've known about a God? There has to be some sort of lesson, some sort of interaction, some sort of, you know, time when we knew about a God, because we can't just create something that we don't know about.
You know, I looked up on Google when atheism started. They said, it's interesting, it actually started right about the beginning of the intertestamental period, when God quit speaking to man.
Yeah.
Which I thought was kind of interesting. So that 1700s is when it really took off, because people became very well educated in Europe, and they started coming up with ideas. But it is interesting that it was during that time frame.
So for the next question, a woman gives birth to a severely retarded baby. You know, the child has virtually no self-awareness and will never be productive. Would it be wrong to kill a child? Does the existence of God have anything to do with this situation? You know, so if you have a child that is born with so many, you know, disabilities and deformities, are you allowed to just kill the child? You know?
In some parts of the world, yes.
Yeah.
That's a big push right now with the debate, is really and truly you can now predict exactly whether or not it's going to have some deficiencies. They have tests they can do on father. And the key is whether they're going to live their whole life mentally incapable, handicapped, and there are many that are pushing that it would be better for them not to live than to live in that state.
I was gonna say, but on the same token, there was a couple from Perrysburg, she was pregnant, and they flat told them that that baby was not gonna be normal and that they should abort, period. And they said, no, God gave them to us and we will deal with what. Well, this child was born, she had, I can't tell you how many surgeries, heart surgeries she had before she was a couple years old. She had tubes in that. And she is probably about 15 now and is doing fine. And if they had chosen to abort her, they would have never known that. They trusted in God.
And even our handicap, you think about our handicaps, but we have handicapped people here in the congregation. We all know they have some disability, and they're a blessing to our congregation. And they not just help us as adults to learn how to handle people, they help the church, and they help their children. And so there is a blessing within being, with the handicapped people list. But again, some people are talking about a little bit of this idea of the side of believing God. The opposite side in every case is chaos. You don't have a designer. When you don't design something, you end up with a messed up program, okay?
Yeah.
Somebody's gotta do it or it's chaos. You don't have ethical standards, you've got a society full of chaos. And you end up with no expectations of what we do as a church. Then you end up with denominationalism and sometimes major chaos. So, you have a choice. Even a person who doesn't believe in God can see the opposing side of something like destroying life in certain areas and how it brings about more chaos.
Because it kind of goes to the argument of like why euthanasia is still wrong. Just because a person doesn't want to live at this moment, almost like to the point of suicide, it doesn't make it right to take away that life. A lot of people's troubles and ailments are temporary. And, people who are committing, considering suicide, a lot of times they only see the negative aspects of life. So when you look at the child who is affected by some type of, Down syndrome or whatever case it may be, they're not looking for the positive. They're not looking to see what could be better, what could be for tomorrow. They don't understand that it is a blessing to be in this world and to be a creation of God. And no matter how life treats you, there's always something better. And to know that we have hope for a kingdom in heaven with God in Christ, it makes whatever we're going through worth it in the end. Thank you for your comments and your questions.
Thank you.